Hey everyone, God bless you. Thanks so much for tuning in. I have a reflection that I have prepared for you entitled Bogus Protestant Historiography. Before I launch into that, it's a little chilly out here in California. 62 degrees on this December day, so I have my beanie on. Maybe I don't need it. Maybe I don't need it because I'm here in the office. I think it's 67 here in studio, so I'll leave it aside. You have to forgive me with as much poking of California that happens across the West. Every now and then a little pushback is called for, is it not? This reflection is mostly about the sacredness of Christian history and the value and the extreme importance of a tangible connection, an organic connection with the historic Church of Christ. Being connected to Jesus and his body, the church, is exceedingly important. The body of Christ is Christ on the earth, and he said that he would build his church and that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. St. Augustine says that if you want the whole Christ, if you want the totus Christus, then you have to have Jesus at the right hand of the Father in glory and his church, which in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians is called the fullness of him who fills all in all. That is the whole Christ. And so to be serious about being connected, organically connected, and living within the church that was started 2,000 years ago and is triumphant to this day, is exceedingly important. The faith was once delivered to the saints, Jude says, and we have to hold to that faith. It's not something that's made up over time. It is a sacred deposit. St. Paul describes the faith as a sacred deposit that's guarded, these are his words, guarded and passed on through a process in sacred tradition of organic catechesis and instruction from spiritual father to spiritual children over history, over time. Being connected to that church and not being satisfied with a connection to a religious organization or body that is not authentically a part of that church and is not connected to that church, this is something extremely important. St. Paul learned the hard way that you can interact with, Jesus does interact with people, of course, outside the church. He seeks all men. And so he appeared to St. Paul when Paul was not yet a Christian and was a persecutor on the road to Damascus. That interaction was quite traumatic for St. Paul, and he learned very clearly not to separate Jesus from his church. Jesus, who had been glorified in the resurrection, his majesty had been set forth, and he took our flesh and planted it at the right hand of the Father. That had happened years before St. Paul met Christ on the road to Damascus. And Jesus said to St. Paul, "Why are you persecuting me?" Of course, he wasn't touching Jesus directly in his glorified humanity. He was touching Jesus directly by touching the church. To persecute the church, Paul found out, was to persecute Christ, because Christ and his church cannot be separated, and the church is Christ on the earth. So what happened? Jesus told him, go see Bishop Ananias in Damascus. He went to the bishop and got baptized. Same thing happened with Cornelius the centurion, a pious man. God sought him and sent an angel to him and told him how much he respected his prayers and his piety, since he was a God-fearer and was imitating the people of God. And what did he do? Immediately he said, send for Peter. And Peter came and he was baptized in his whole family. That's how you remain organically connected to God and to his Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, is in and through the church. The church has been for 2,000 years filling the world with light and salting it to retard its corruption and to flavor its life. It is about the process of making disciples of all the nations right now. We can never separate Christ from his church, and we can never be satisfied with imitation churches, with efforts to make church that isn't authentic and isn't connected organically with the church that Jesus himself established. There are all sorts of bogus historiographies. I usually place them under the image of the parenthesis theory. If you've read my book, Rock and Sand, An Orthodox Perspective of the Protestant Reformers and Their Teachings, you'll know that I speak in that text about the parenthesis theory. This is the idea that is the presupposition, the theological presupposition of all of the Christian denominations that are not the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. They all have to affirm that somehow after the apostles died, the lights went out. Jesus' promise that I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it somehow collapsed. And the gates of hell did prevail until this or that leader came along and relit the candle, so to speak. So it could be Martin Luther, 1517. It could be John Calvin. It could be, John Bunyan. It could be the Baptists in 1689. Whatever. It could be more aberrant groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses and Charles Taze Russell in 1844, or the Mormons and Joseph Smith, or the Seventh-day Adventists and Ellen White. Whatever. They all have their person that supposedly kind of recovered, and they make up this interpretation of the great apostasy that St. Paul refers to, as though somehow it refers to the collapse of the church for 1,500 years, 1,500 years, or 1,800 years, or whatever, until this or that person came and kind of brought it back. From the outside, of course, it's a laughable and grotesque joke. It's understandable. They had to come up with something. The parenthesis theory is the usual move. As difficult as it is to defend, of course, because the presupposition of the parenthesis theory is that Jesus is a weakling and his promises to guard and protect the church throughout history failed. There's another alternative, though. It's not as common as the parenthesis theory, but there's another form of bogus Protestant historiography, and that is an effort to establish some sort of historical continuity and to affirm that these modern Protestant groups, and I'm using that word, of course, very broadly if I'm going to include groups like the Seventh-day Adventists and the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. They try to make an argument, Protestants typically do, who are pursuing this minority opinion, that they are in fact in line, and that if you look back, you'll see that there is one grand tapestry of Christian teaching consistent with this, with their Protestant group. Now, that's very, very difficult to argue, but I'm glad there's an attempt for it to be made, because the parenthesis theory is so obviously ridiculous. To try to at least make an attempt to establish historical continuity with some core kernel of essential Christian faith is a better idea. I recently saw a video clip published by Ligonier Ministries. Ligonier Ministries is a ministry started by the late Dr. R.C. Sproul, a man who I loved very much and was one of my professors, a very esteemed Presbyterian teacher and theologian who's had a tremendous impact on Protestantism across the United States. One of his teachers, a man named Pastor Steve Lawson, did a series called Pillars of Grace, and I recently came across a video clip in which he was advertising this, and he was advertising it as a beautiful historic tapestry of the faith where God has guided his church for 2,000 years. And he said from Athanasius to Augustine to Wycliffe, and then he went into all the Protestant leaders. Now, I found that fascinating, absolutely fascinating, not just because it's completely untrue, not just because it's completely made up, which it is, but usually any effort to have established historical continuity by Protestant people begins with Augustine and pretty much ends with Augustine. When I was in Protestant seminary, which I loved very much, actually, the obvious weakness was our church history, which was very focused on the Reformation and very, very little in the first 3/4 of the church, right? Because the Protestant Reformation is a 16th century phenomenon. But if you are going to have a patristic class, and I had one, it was essentially St. Augustine. And then they moved to Thomas Aquinas and his Summa. But it was church history completely through the lens of Calvinism, church history completely through the lens of the Reformed faith. They had to do that, of course, because if we were being guided into a broad evaluation of church history, we would find out very quickly that the church fathers were not Protestant. And if they weren't Protestant, what were they? That's a question that no Protestant wants to ask. And what I was amazed about by Steve Lawson's promo for his series Pillars of Grace was that he began with St. Athanasius. And in no way, shape, or form can Reformed people find much there that's uniquely Protestant or Reformed or Calvinistic in any way from St. Athanasius. As a matter of fact, St. Athanasius, one of the greatest of the church fathers, can in no way be squarely planted and claimed by anybody who is a Protestant. St. Athanasius was a great bishop of Alexandria and would never have given communion to any Protestant person because of the heresies inherent in Protestantism. He would have asked that they be catechized and that they renounce their heresies, and then he would have brought them into the church. It's an extremely dangerous thing for any Protestant to read the works of St. Athanasius the Great. I would heartily encourage it if you come from a Protestant background. You will be greatly thrilled. The man was an incredible Christian and holy man, and your heart will be delighted. In his promo, Pastor Lawson, for his series Pillars of Grace, in which he was trying to affirm this kind of historiography in which somehow Protestantism fits with the Christianity of the first 15 centuries of the church. He said it's Athanasius, it's Augustine, it's Wycliffe. That's where he jumped immediately to the 14th century. Wycliffe, I think, is 1330 to 1384 or something. Often claimed as a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation. That's pushing it. He wouldn't have been accepted into any Protestant church for his teachings, even though he had he was a forerunner of some particular heresies of Protestantism. And then John Huss, he mentioned Huss. Huss was the Czech Catholic priest who was disciplined for some of his teachings, which the Protestants also somehow, Martin Luther thought he was kind of an initial spark that led to the Protestant reformers, although Huss was no Lutheran and no Calvinist whatsoever. And then he mentioned Tyndale Luther, Zwingli Calvin. And then he added this, Pastor Lawson added this, quote, "They speak with one voice, one God working in perfect unity." Forgive me, that is an utter complete lie. Shame on him for lying so brutally, so viciously, to suggest that Athanasius and St. Augustine, let alone these other Latin heretics, Catholic heretics who were condemned by the Catholic Church like Wycliffe and Huss, who are claimed by the Protestants and forerunners, to suggest that they all speak with one voice with Luther and Zwingli and Calvin, that is just shameless, absolutely shameless. As a matter of fact, the Protestant reformers themselves didn't speak with one voice. Luther hated Zwingli, and they literally fought. They went to war against each other. They considered themselves to be heretics. The idea that somehow there's a grand narrative here that can be claimed by Protestantism, it's simply not true. There is a grand narrative. It's called Orthodox Catholic Christianity. There is a grand narrative, but it has nothing to do with this bogus historiography. I remember reading in the works of the Princetonian Reformed theologian B.B. Warfield that Protestantism, Calvinism in general, can be essentially defined as choosing St. Augustine's doctrines of grace over against St. Augustine's ecclesiology and sacramentology. That is more accurate. I don't think it's completely correct, but even St. Augustine can't be claimed, only parts of St. Augustine, the parts that fit with Protestantism. At least Dr. Warfield was honest enough to admit it. They weren't following Augustine. They were picking and choosing select portions of St. Augustine's teaching, and the same can be said with Thomas Aquinas. They pick and choose to try to root themselves in the tradition when they're not rooted. This concept of bogus Protestant historiography, which is just so obvious but not talked about very much, can also be seen in this very famous collection, this unique Protestant martyrology called Fox's Book of Martyrs. This is an effort on the part of early Protestantism to place the martyrs of the Protestant Reformation, like the Oxford martyrs, for instance, who were in conflict, of course, with the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century and following, to place them in this kind of historical line. So this is another attempt. It's a much more ancient attempt, but an early Protestant attempt to do the same thing that Steve Lawson tried to do with his series Pillars of Grace. If you look at I remember reading this in, late 80s or early 90s. This edition was published in 1981 by Whitaker House. But it has a list like you might find in an Orthodox martyrology. And it starts with a chapter on the early Christians. It's a long chapter, almost, 38 pages. And it surveys many of the great Orthodox Christian martyrs of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. I wrote down some of their names. John Fox documents through our own writings, through the Church's own saints, the movements of the 12 Holy Apostles, where they went, the evangelization that took place, and their martyrdoms. Then he moves to St. Ignatius, the God-bearer, right, who was a martyr in the Roman Colosseum around 107, and he describes his life. Then he goes to St. Polycarp. These are incredible saints that have nothing to do with Protestantism and never in their wildest dreams would have accepted someone to Holy Communion who held Protestant convictions about the Church and the sacraments. It would have been impossible. He goes then from St. Polycarp to the Holy Martyr Blandina, to St. Lawrence of Rome, to St. Alban, the proto-martyr of Britain, to St. Cyprian, of all people that he would claim, the great defender of the ecclesiology of the Church, to Clement of Alexandria. It's a fascinating chapter that he does in 38 pages. The second chapter he devotes to Constantine the Great. Now, I think that chapter should be read by all modern Protestants to see what one of their influential forerunners thought about the Holy Emperor Constantine the Great. And then immediately, chapter 3, after just dealing with a few of the great martyrs of the first few centuries, what do you know? The life of John Wycliffe. So he goes from, let's say, 312, when Emperor Constantine issued his Edict of Milan, 1,000 years. He jumps 1,000 years to a man that can be, in some sense, claimed as a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation, who lived 1330 to 1384. And then he goes through many of the martyrs, William Tyndale, Martin Luther, John Hooper. These are all the Protestant martyrs, the martyrs of Scotland, Hugh Latimer, Bishop Ridley, etc. Cranmer. That's Fox's Book of Martyrs. It's his attempt once more to try to center, to establish these Protestant Christian leaders in some sort of historical milieu that shows that they are being faithful to the Christian faith, just as it has been defended throughout church history. It's a bold and brash affirmation, and in my opinion, a complete failure, an absolute laughable joke. To affirm that continuity between Christians of the early centuries who were very clear about their faith, and then to append Protestant leaders who denied much of the teaching of the undivided church, to put that together in one book is to suggest that they were all martyred for the same cause. This is disingenuous. This is bogus historiography, and it should be dumped, completely dumped. Orthodox Catholic Christianity is the apostolic faith, and it has been confessed and lived for 20 centuries. If you yourself are watching and you're from a Protestant background, or a background of some contemporary Christian movement, that isn't connected to the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. I would invite you to come to an Orthodox church. If you live somewhere in Southern California, I would invite you to come to my parish, St. Andrew, here in Riverside. When you walk in, you will see painted on the walls several hundred full-length saints, men and women, from every century of the church, from all the lands where Christians have evangelized successfully over these last 2,000 years. They all look different, men, women, old, young, all sorts of professions and backgrounds, but they have one thing in faith, in common, and that is they confess the Orthodox faith. For them, the Nicene Creed is the expression of the unchanging Christian faith, and there is a real historiography. Christ has built his church, and the gates of hell have not prevailed, and it's his will for everyone to find refuge, peace, stability, and life in his church. So please embrace Christian history and dump the bogus Protestant historiography, which isn't going to be helpful, and root yourself in the undivided church. God be with you.